Yo, JD here, Limitless, and as you can see, we're on F1 2020 here today. And this video here is probably going to be a little bit of a long one, but I feel it's going to be one that is going to be extremely important. No matter what your experience level, I think this is something that everyone really needs to understand. Because with setups, what I'm known for and what I've done a lot in the past, and a lot of people ask me, setups are just completely individual in my opinion. You could take the fastest esport guy's setup or the fastest time on time trial, load it in, and you'll be amazed of how hard it is to control, how slow it is. And that's because everyone's driving style is completely different. And if you don't understand the key components of the setup, you're not going to reach anywhere near your max potential. That's a complete fact. So today in this video, I'm going to do my best to explain each element of the setup, how it works in the most simple terms as possible, and what I would recommend for a good balance on this game, like we did with previous games and stuff as well. And with my content going forward, I found my explanation videos that I haven't gone in as much detail or been as clear and concise at times. So I'm really going to make an effort to really change that from going forward. So if you like this video, please subscribe, please let me know. And with the setup combinations itself, as we're going to look at this now, you can see there are no differences. So we've got the aerodynamics, transmission, suspension geometry, suspension, brakes, and tire pressures. The only thing that's different is that we now have individual tire pressures. But if you do like this video and you want me to go into even more detail, I will happily make a video on each of these components independently with gameplay to actually showcase the real changes when I change something on here, on how it really reacts, so you can see it on the track itself. So if you want me to do that, then please let me know and I will be very, very happy to do it. But today I'm going to try best to explain what each of these do to give you a really good starting point on understanding the setup so you can build your own, because I think that is definitely the best way to maximize your potential. So starting with the aerodynamics, pretty self-explanatory, but the more towards the right, as the game allows us to do it, the more downforce that you are going to get, and that improves overall grip. But the downside of this is that it increases drag, which means you're going to be slower in a straight line. One thing to think about as well is not only the overall grip that is going to be increased with the slow straight line speed, but the shorter the braking distance is going to be as well, and the potential of tire temps and tire wear to be higher with this. But the lower you go is the opposite effect really. Lower you go, the best straight line speed that you're going to have, but you're not going to have as good downforce. It's going to be quite understeery, quite loose on the rear end as well, which is another thing. The higher you go here, the more traction potential that you are going to have. It's going to feel very loose, very lazy, but it's going to be very quick in a straight line. As we saw in the previous game, and from what I found so far in this game, I think having a very similar strategy where you have the lower front wing. So ideally you want a car to be as fast as possible in a straight line, which I think the front wing has a much more of effect on the straight line speed than lowering the rear wing, in my opinion. You want to have this as low as possible, but the rear of the car to also be relatively as close as possible, but still having a big enough gap where you have a good balance between the two. And I think starting off with 4.9 in this game is actually a really, really good starting point for most tracks. But the problem is, if you ran 4.6 or 4.5, you would find the car would be very, very pointy. Yes, you would have a little bit better straight line speed, but hardly anything at all. But you would just lose that rear stability. So having more downforce on the rear compared to the front is just going to give you a lot more traction and the car to be just a lot more stable. And I think on this game, that is very, very important. So that's the approach that I would go for. On previous games, you could get away with running like 3-1 wings and stuff like that. But the problem with this, having the front wing to be more dominant than the rear, the more dominant part of the downforce, it's like what was mentioned today in the Formula 1 practice session. You will quickly find the rear end will act like a pendulum and it will just be in front of you before you even know it. So I think it's really important to have a lower front wing and a higher rear wing to give you that maximum stability while still having some rotation and good straight line speed, because you are going to use the rest of the SERP to get that extra rotation that you need, because you need to think of it as an orchestra with these components. You know, you change one thing, but you need to counteract it with another thing to get the desired result you want, if that makes sense. So moving over to the transmission now. This is something I know a lot of people really struggled to get their head around. I did for sure when this came out in 2017. But the transmission, otherwise known as a differential, is basically the transmission of the rotary motion, or it transmits the rotary motion from the gearbox to the drive shaft to create a forward motion in the car. And this is identified at the rear of the car on this game. And you've got two different components. You've got the on throttle and the off throttle. In my opinion, it's the off throttle is the far more significant aspect of this. Unfortunately, this is the part that you cannot change though when you're actually in a race. So when it's parc fermé or in like career mode and you're just in the race itself, the only part you can change is the off throttle here, which is a little bit annoying. But in a nutshell, the further you go towards the right, or a more locked setup itself, the better outright traction potential that you could find. But it's going to be much more susceptible, or a much more risk to you losing the car, not snapping on you, getting oversteer, not being able to correct it. It basically is going to be much harder to get that potential traction. But if you can be smooth on the power, you should be having a better exit. Whereas if you go lower down, and this is the reason why you see in wet conditions that everyone goes lower down, but even in the dry conditions in F1 2019 and even on this game, for what I found, there isn't really much of a time gain that you would get from going from a locked to an unlocked. Though the potential time gain is really not noticeable. So I think you would always be running a 50 diff on this game, like you did on the previous one. And with this, it's just much easier to get on the traction. And if you do lose the car on the traction, it's just much easier to control. Whereas if it's locked, it's a lot tougher to control it. So it's just going to be easier on the traction, but the potential traction might not be as good in terms of lap time. But in my opinion, it really is not noticeable. I think you should be running 50% all the time, completely unlocked. However, with the off throttle, this is by far the most significant part of this. If you go 100% locked, what you will find is that the car will be very stable, very understeery, and it will be very hard to lose the car. But the car will just not want to rotate because it is locked into position. The wheels are just locked, hence why it's called that. Whereas if you're going off the throttle, you'll find once you're actually going down the gears, or you're like halfway through a corner, the wheels will just want to rotate all the time. And yeah, this will give you a lot of rotation, but it will just be too much rotation. It will make the car feel very unstable and very difficult to control, meaning that the traction probably won't be good because you just can't control it, and you're just going to be always counter steering all the time. So in my opinion, and this is what you saw from a lot of drivers, particularly in esports, they always run 50-70, so not quite halfway, but 50-70 because it's easier to get on the traction. But then it does still rotate. It rotates more than it being stable, but you need the rotation in this game, because since you don't have the ballast or the weight distribution like you had in F1 2018, this is a method to use to get that rotation. So the lower you go, the more rotation you're going to get. The higher you go, the more understeer, more stability you're going to get. So again, it's all about finding that balance. And for me, I think 50-70, especially in this game, works very well. But if you are struggling with the car rotating too much when you're going off the throttle and you're turning, and you find it's just turning way too much, then it might be worth actually increasing this itself. But an easy way to remember what this does is that the on throttle really affects the car on the exits of the corner. So once you're actually gone on the throttle on the exit, but this, it only affects the car on the entry and as you're going through the corner itself. So that the mid part of the corner when you're downshifting, going up in revs and stuff like that as well. That's a really easy way to remember of each way it does. So more to the left, more rotation, more to the right, more stability, but less performance really. Moving over to suspension geometry, I think probably the hardest part of the setup to really kind of get your head round. I know it was for me, and I think it still is today sometimes. This part of the setup, I don't think it really gains you a significant amount of time, but I think it can really help you with your consistency and just finding you a good sweet spot throughout the whole time, because I used to run really the same geometry at all times, whereas I know a lot of the esport drivers, particularly when you're at that level, you want to find every inch of time possible, because it really can actually make a big difference. So you've got two things here. You've got the camber and the toe. The toe is what the angles of the wheels look like from directly above. So if you're a bird above the car looking straight down, is whatever the angles of the wheels are. Probably put a picture up on the screen now. Now you've got the camber, which is the angle of the wheels if you were standing directly in front of the car or directly behind, is what the angle of the wheels are going to be looking at, if they're going to be in or out. With this here, on the previous game, I used to run right, left. I know a lot of people did, and I found this just gave me a good balance because it was the opposite to each other. It just gave me a lot of stability, some good rotation, just a consistent feeling all the time here. But we're going to go through each one of these and just try and explain the best I can of exactly how it works. So with a complete max toe going towards the right, you will find it will be very responsive, but the car can actually wash away mid-corner. So upon the entry, it will be really responsive, but as you get into the middle of the corner, there'll just be too much lateral load on the tyre. It will then become a little bit unstable, and it might even understeer, start to wash away, push on from the car itself with just too much load on it. And this can actually increase tyre wear because it just has so much more low speed rotation. It can make it quite a unstable experience, because on F1 2013 we used to run left, right, and you could get away with this because tyre temps weren't really an issue or anything at all. But on this game, it's something you need to get a good balance with. So it will make it very responsive, but the chance of understeer and just pushing on in the mid corner is just a lot higher. Whereas if you go to the minimum toe, the opposite effect. It's not going to be aggressive upon entry to the corner, so you'll probably find it will just be a lot more stable going into the corner itself. It won't want to be spitting out on you or anything at all. Not as aggressive, and it's going to feel a lot more planted and stable throughout the corner itself. And it's going to have a better high speed rotation, because it's just going to be much more stable in the high speed. So for like Maggotts and Beckett's, you'd probably want to be going much more to a negative to a minimum toe compared to a high toe, in my opinion. Which is why right, left was quite a common thing in this game, because there's a lot of high speed. You want to carry a lot of apex speed in this game. You really want a car that is planted on the entry and the mid corner itself. It feels a lot better than going all the way to the right, in my opinion. On 2019 and also on this game as well, you might want a little bit, because it will give you better low speed rotation, and maybe a little bit on the rear, to just because the rear, you really want the rear to be a little bit more dominant in this game. You might want a bit more on that aspect for the low speed rotation, but the left is normally quite a good bet as well. Moving over to the camber itself, if we are running the minimum camber here, it will feel quite unstable and not that planted, because it will be too loaded and it can't cope with the downforce. However, it will be better in the high speed. Whereas if you run the camber to the max, it will feel a lot more stable, a lot more responsive, and it can handle the low better in the low speed corners. So better in the low speed, better in the high speed. That's really the best way that I can describe it. So camber more to the left is better in the high speed corners. Camber to the right really helps in low speed corners. And I found towards the end of F1 2019 that this was actually a really good compromise. This really worked particularly well for me, in my opinion, just having this kind of balance. And starting off in 2020, I've also found that this is a very good balance. So those are what the components actually do, but it's just a case of, this is probably the part you really go have to test the most, which is annoying, I know, but that's how it works in a nutshell. Moving over to the suspension now, which is on quite weird settings from the actual default setting itself, but there are 3 elements of this as well. So there's the suspension, the anti-roll bars, and the ride height itself. And the suspension is really responsible for how the car actually feels over bumps. I think this is what makes the biggest difference for me, in my opinion. It can give you better tyre wear, better temperatures, and overall just a much more smoother experience, in my opinion. However, the front and rear do work in opposite ways, really. So the front suspension, if you reduce it, it is going to give you more oversteer. But if you increase it, it's going to give you more understeer. And then if we go to the rear, it's actually the opposite here. So if you reduce it, it's going to do more understeer, increase it, more oversteer. And that's why you saw a lot of people quite often run 1-1 to just get a balance between the two. But a lot of people used to run like 1-3 or something like that, because the front part of it will be quite pointy, but then the rear part of it will balance it as well, because it will just have more oversteer. So it's just a good balance between the two. I think, in my opinion, I used to run 1-2, try and get them as close as I possibly could. And again, the lower you go on both of these components, the better it is actually going to be over curbs as well, in my opinion. Because the higher you go, the more firm and the more stiff it's going to be. It doesn't feel necessarily bad, but towards the end of a lap, like in a qualifying lap, or just if you're going over a bumpy circuit, you will start to find the car will just be, it won't be as flexible as it needs to be. So the tires are going to go over curbs. It's going to be very, very unpredictable, unstable. So I think really going as low as you can and having the rear a little bit higher is definitely the way to go, I think, for this game as well. As for the anti-roll bars, they work in a pretty similar fashion. So if you ran 111, this is going to give you the maximum rotation possible, really. But if you put up the front anti-roll bar, it's going to make it more stable, but less responsive. And with this, it's going to do the opposite here. The lower you go here, the less responsive it's going to be, but the more stable it's going to be. And quite often I ran 510 or something like that to just give me a really, really good balance between the two. I know a lot of people ran that 3.9. Lower you go on the rear, it's actually going to give you a little bit better traction as well, but it just won't give you as good response on the rear, which I know a lot of people ran that 511, where the front's going to be a little bit under control, but the rear is going to be really gripping up. It's kind of weird. It's not pointy if you do it at 111, so it's not the front end's going to be really, really aggressive and responsive. It's just that once you feed it into the corner, the rear is really going to grip up, and then the rear is going to rotate. And if you have a rear that rotates too much, like I mentioned before, you'll find the car will just be very, very unstable. So I think, in my opinion, 310 is really the maximum you want to go. And in this game, I think 310 or 3.9 again is going to be a very, very good starting point for you. In terms of the ride height now, this is an interesting one. The higher you go, the slower in a straight line that you are going to be, but the more stable it's going to be. Kind of works the same in a way as the front wings, in a way, if you think about it like that. So in a straight line, but it's going to be much more stable. And that's why in wet conditions on previous games, 1111 was actually pretty overpowered in these conditions. However, the thing that is different is the responsiveness. If you put it lower, the responsiveness is going to be much better. It's going to be a lot more aggressive, a lot more responsive, as I said, a lot more downforce you will find with a 1-1. However, I think 1-1 is going to be incredibly unstable, very, very unstable. And that's why, quite similar to the suspension, you really want the rear to be higher to counteract that, to give you a good balance. And I think, in my opinion, having at least a 2-point gap between the two is really, really needed. Because the higher you go, the more stable it's going to be and the better traction that you will get, but the not as good downforce or the straight line speed that you will get. In my opinion, I think 2.4 is very, very good because it gives you good downforce, a decent straight line speed, good traction, and a good balance between the front and the rear ride heights. Whereas 1.3 will definitely be more responsive, but a little bit more unstable. Another thing to remember as well, opposite to the suspension here, if you have more distance cleared from the track to the car, so the higher you go, the better over curbs that this is going to be as well. So that's why I think 2.4 works very well, or 3.5 works very, very well. If you find this a little bit too unstable, then I'd probably put it up to 3.5. It's not going to make a huge difference in straight line speed, not as responsive, so you might have to lower this a little bit or raise this to get the more response. But it's all about finding what works for you, and this is something that you are just going to have to play around with. As for the braking, pretty self-explanatory really. The more maximum pressure, the more stopping potential that you have, the maximum potential that you will have. Although an increase in brake pressure can result in a shorter stopping distance, which is good, but it means you run into the risk of locking up much more often. So it's going to be very harder, a risk and reward system. So a better reward, but a much higher risk of making mistakes. However, with the brake bias, if you go more towards the rear, this will stop the likelihood of you locking up, but it will make it a bit more unstable, a lot more instability. And the thing to remember as well, if you put it more towards the rear, the braking distance is actually going to be shorter as well. But this is why you see in wet conditions and like in qualifying, you'll see a more towards the rear, because it allows you to, as you're braking, it allows you to actually change direction quicker as well. Whereas if you had it more towards the front, it's more kind of locked in. If you brake, then you'll be more susceptible to locking up and then going straight, but then it's also a lot more rigid. Whereas if you have it more towards the rear, you'll find it can change direction much easier. Now, you can put more effort into the brake and it will not lock up or make mistakes. So more towards the rear just makes the rotation of the car better, more responsiveness when you're like going through Mackers and Beckett's, for example. If you ran 57 and you braked, you'd find the car would be a bit more understeer really in terms of changing direction. Whereas if here, it will change direction much better, much more response, less likely to lock up. But having it more towards the front sometimes is something what you want to do when you're in a race situation, because it just makes it much more stable and consistent at the same time. Whereas if here, it's much easier to lose the car with rear locking and much more susceptible to rear locking. With the tyre pressures now, this is something, it's kind of a new territory for me in terms of individual tyre pressures, but basically the way that they work, the more towards the max, you are going to have more response and you're going to have better straight line speed. That's what I found from these games. Whereas the lower you go, the better traction that you are going to have, because actually the more surface area of the tyre, it's like, imagine a deflated balloon. Deflated is going to cover more area of the floor, more inflated, less surface area on the floor. And more surface area gives you more friction and more traction. but it's not going to give you, it's going to create more drag because there's more area of it. So that's the best way to explain it. And that's why you saw quite often with the front tyres being higher than the rear tyres. And I think this is probably what you're going to see again. But on this game, I think tyre pressures are very, very sensitive. So you might not want to go as high as this. Although I still think you want the front tyres to be higher than the rears, because you want a little bit more response in the front tyres than the rear tyres. Because to be honest, overheating the front tyres is not a bad thing, because then it actually makes the car more stable. Because if you have a car that's more responsive on the front, it's just going to drag the rear of the car around. If the rear tyres go off, it's going to be a lot harder to control. So that is really it for the setup itself. I tried to go in as much detail as I can. Apologies if it's a little bit of a longer video. Let me know if you enjoyed this. Let me know if you want me to go into more concepts. But I tried to explain it in the most simple terms as I could, in the most detailed way as I could. Please don't hesitate to ask me anything. Let me know what you want me to see next in future videos, and I will catch you very, very soon. Peace.